What was the creepiest thing you saw in real life? Story 1. The so-called caring, loving Christian church I will never go back to. After tonight invited homeless people for a midnight dinner, then told them they could not have a plate unless they paid $3 for it. The pastor took a plate out of a homeless man's hand and said God would feed him. I had left my wallet at home, and they would not even let me, a member of the church, get a plate for my 2-year-old son who was crying. They said to let the paying Christians eat first, and then, if there were leftovers, we could have some. And he said, God willing and amen. I had to hold myself back from reacting. I left early and decided after that experience that I am never going back to church. Tonight broke my heart. I have given up so much for this church, and only now do I realize that the credit card readers for donations used twice a service probably are not going to feed the homeless like they say, but instead are used to buy all those fancy LG brand flat screen televisions all over the church. The pastor even has expensive rims on his car. I have been an idiot. While some of the messages were good, after what they did tonight, I will never go back. Story 2. My own mother was attacked by a dog while holding the cat I had grown up with. Our neighbors raced greyhounds, and our cat was sunbathing outside on the veranda when one of their greyhounds escaped the pen it was housed in and was not wearing a muzzle. Unfortunately, our cat was the first living thing the dog spotted at the same time my mother walked out the front door. She tried to quickly grab the cat, but by the time she reached him, the dog had already made it onto our veranda, knocking my mother off onto the ground a few feet below and beginning a terrifying struggle for both of their lives. Luckily, I was home at the time, as well as my father, who had been asleep after a long night at work. I heard her screams for help, ran outside, and was stunned for a few moments before screaming for my father, who rushed out and tried to separate the dog from them both. By this time, my mother's arms were badly injured and our cat's hip was dislocated, but thankfully both were still alive. A ranger and an ambulance were called, and a few days later the police attended, although when they approached our neighbors to locate the dog, they had hidden it on another property where it was eventually found. To this day, years later, they have never approached any of us to apologize. Story 3, I was having a great night at a pub when I met up with two girls I knew, and we decided to go to another pub down the road. We stepped outside and immediately discovered the aftermath of an argument between two guys on the street. One man had pushed the other onto the road, where he was struck by a semi-trailer. Apparently, the truck driver did not even realize he had hit anything and thought it was just a rough patch of road. There was a man lying motionless on the street. His friends were completely distraught, and the person who pushed him was still full of adrenaline and did not seem to comprehend what had actually happened. The scene was deeply disturbing and something I will never forget. The man who caused it still seemed to think something could be done and kept insisting that we focus on helping his friend. We tried to explain that it was already too late, but he shouted that it was never too late. The girls I was with suddenly did not feel like partying anymore, so I made sure they got into a taxi safely. When the police arrived, I warned them about the severity of what they were about to see. I then wandered down the road and noticed a couple walking toward the scene, so I advised them to take a detour down a side street to avoid witnessing it. They thanked me and changed direction. That was the best thing I managed to do that night, sparing at least one couple from seeing something that stayed with me for weeks and still comes back to me when I think about it. Story 4. Me and my dad were possibly the last people to see someone alive before they ended their life. Where I am from, the beach is within walking distance, and as my dad and I were walking back, we passed a guy on the path. We both said hello, but he did not respond. He only gave us a quick glance and looked extremely miserable. We brushed it off, assuming he was just grumpy. A minute or two later, after replaying his face in my mind, I realized I was pretty sure he was someone from my school. Not someone I spoke to much, but definitely someone I recognized. I think it was the next day that we found out he had taken his own life near a small wooden bridge, a bit further down the path to the beach. After learning that, other details from that night began to make sense, like the sirens we heard later on. By pure coincidence, we also spoke that night to a man my dad knew who owned a quad bike, which turned out to be the same quad bike used to bring the body up from the path to the main road. Even though I did not witness anything graphic like others have described, such as seeing a body, The reason this remains one of the most disturbing things I have experienced is the look on that guy's face. It is permanently ingrained in my memory. He was not being rude or grumpy. He was on his way to do something final, something he had decided he needed to do. For a long time afterward, I could not stop thinking about what my dad and I might have seen if we had walked by a little later, or what might have happened if I had stopped him and talked to him, wondering if it would have changed anything. My friends and family eventually helped me stop thinking like that, reminding me that there was no point. What disturbs me the most is not knowing, because that uncertainty allows your mind to spiral and imagine all kinds of things. Story 5. 6 years ago, I was sitting on my front porch around midday on a Monday, which was my only day off because I worked as a restaurant general manager. We lived in a quiet neighborhood, so when I heard a young woman crying hysterically and struggling to speak, I became concerned. I found a teenage girl in front of my neighbor's house, standing on the phone and looking up at the house number. When I approached her, she pushed her phone into my hand. I said hello and was immediately greeted by an emergency operator asking for the address, which I provided right away. The operator asked several questions, which I relayed to the girl, and she then led me inside the house. We went down into the basement, where there was a makeshift bedroom in the unfinished area. I saw a person lying face down on the bed, arms extended with elbows bent at right angles, and I described this to the operator. She asked me to try turning the person over, and as I reached out, I noticed the skin was an alarming shade of purple on the front side and felt cold in a way that immediately felt wrong. I attempted to turn her over, but the position of her arms made it impossible. The operator asked if I believed she was beyond help, and I confirmed quietly, making sure the teenage girl could not hear. When the paramedics arrived, I led the girl outside while she remained hysterical. Her phone, still in my hand, began to ring. It was my 40-year-old neighbor, the mother of the daughter we had just found. I showed the phone to the girl, and she said she could not answer it. I reluctantly picked up and had to tell a mother that her child was gone, and I have never heard a more devastating sound in my life. Later, I learned that the 18-year-old daughter had a history of severe seizures and was on medication to control them. She had experienced a seizure the night before, returned home from the hospital, and went to bed. Her mother and stepfather left early the next morning to travel about 3 hours away. When they could not reach her, they sent her 16-year-old friend to check on her, and that friend broke into the house after receiving no response. We also discovered that the daughter had stopped taking her medication because her stepfather constantly belittled and verbally abused her. Story 6. I remember working as a security guard for a hospital where I was assigned to watch certificate of need patients, which were individuals transferred from a local asylum who were considered extremely unstable. On my third shift ever with that company, I was assigned to watch a man who had picked up pencils, stabbed a worker several times, then used a fresh one to stab himself multiple times in the stomach. I worked the overnight shift from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning. My job was to sit in the hallway outside his room in a mostly abandoned wing of the intensive care unit, where I might see one person per hour at most. It was just me, alone in a chair in the middle of a silent hallway for 12 hours straight. I was freshly 18 years old at the time and had very little experience with situations like this. Around 3 in the morning, I fell asleep in my chair outside his door. I was awakened by the patient himself after he had broken his own wrist to slip out of the handcuffs restraining him to the bed. He had ripped out his catheter and intravenous line and tapped me on the shoulder to wake me. I turned and saw him standing there completely naked, bleeding from multiple places, holding his injured wrist, calmly telling me that he needed to use the bathroom. I tried to keep everything as calm and normal as possible so the situation would not escalate. I walked him to the bathroom and immediately called my commanding officer while he was inside. My commanding officer arrived before the patient came out, and together we restrained him back onto the bed. The nurses returned and reconnected all of his medical equipment. My commanding officer, not knowing that I had fallen asleep, told me I handled the situation correctly and said I would do great at the job because I did not panic and make things worse. I thanked him, finished my shift at 7 in the morning, and never returned for another shift with that security company. To this day, I realize how lucky I was that he did not use his intravenous line as a weapon while I was asleep. Story 7. A few years ago, I went out late at night to take my aunt to John Fitzgerald Kennedy Airport, which is about an hour from my house. Earlier that evening, I was playing an online game with my friends who lived only a few blocks away. I had my windows open because it was a cool summer night when I heard what sounded like a gunshot outside. I did not think much of it because I was focused on the game. About 20 minutes later, I picked up my aunt, drove her to the airport, and returned home around 4:30 in the morning. After dropping off her car, I was driving back toward my house when I noticed around 10 police cars with their lights flashing in front of my driveway. At first, I panicked, thinking something had happened to my family. But as I pulled in closer, I saw something I still cannot forget. My 17-year-old neighbor was lying face down in the driveway, with severe injuries visible around him. I noticed a beer can near his truck and briefly wondered if he had fallen. But then I saw my best friend's truck parked nearby. He was an emergency medical technician at the time, so I called him and learned that my neighbor had taken his own life. I immediately realized that the sound I had heard earlier was the moment he pulled the trigger. I never told his family what I heard or saw that night, but every time I pull into my driveway, I still see him lying there, frozen in my memory. He had access to the firearm because his father was a police officer. Story 8. I have seen and lived through many different kinds of trauma, but there is one moment that still comes back to me often. I was working at a Walgreens that had a liquor store separate from the main building, and I was heading over to count the register and close for the night when a mother who was clearly intoxicated walked out after purchasing a bottle of vodka with her young son following closely behind her. As I passed by, she suddenly collapsed and began having a seizure. The bottle shattered, liquid spilled everywhere, and she had struck her head during the fall. The child began screaming and crying and ran to hide behind a trash can just outside the store. I yelled for my coworker to call emergency services and stayed with the boy, talking to him, asking his name, and reassuring him that his mother was going to be okay while gently keeping him from looking at what was happening. I held his hand and walked him to the ambulance when it arrived, introducing him to the emergency medical technicians who were kind and placed him safely in the front seat. That moment broke something in me because I was that child once. I had lived through almost the exact same situation years earlier, except I had no one to talk to me while I waited for help after calling emergency services myself. I sat alone, crying, watching my own mother experience the same thing. That experience is how I eventually received a diagnosis of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The smell of alcohol, the scene, and the fear in that child's eyes pulled me straight back into my own past, reminding me that my mother chose alcohol over me and my safety every single day. Story 9. I am a hospice nurse, but the most disturbing thing I have ever experienced came from when I worked in adolescent psychiatric care. There was security footage of a teenager with special needs who was completely alone in the living room area. He walked over to the doorway to check where the staff were, then came back to the center of the room. Suddenly, his entire body stiffened, and you could clearly see him elevate about a foot off the ground and move forward roughly 4 feet. Then his body relaxed, and it looked like he gently dropped back down to the floor. He walked back to the doorway again, checked where the staff were, and then returned to the middle of the room and did the same thing again. This time his body stiffened, lifted up, moved a couple of feet to the left, and then moved forward about 6 feet before relaxing again and lowering back down. This happened 2 more times, with the final time lasting the longest, where he stopped moving just moments before a staff member walked into the room. I am an atheist and have been one for most of my life. The woman who showed me this security footage was second in charge at the facility and was honestly one of the few people I have ever met who earned her position purely by being extremely good at her job and genuinely honest. She was the type of person who simply could not lie because she would not be able to live with the guilt. Even though I could not believe what I was seeing with my own eyes, I knew I could believe her. What I was seeing made absolutely no sense. It has been 8 years since I watched that video, and I truly believe that teenager was floating around the room. I think about it often, but I rarely share it because it sounds unbelievable. I have been with my husband for almost 6 years now, and I still have not told him about it, but maybe I will today. Story 10. The most disturbing thing I have ever witnessed involved the living conditions of a small child. I had just started working for a property management company and was still in training when we made the decision to move forward with an eviction. The tenants had been consistently late on rent and owed a significant amount of money, and we already knew from inspections and maintenance visits that they were severely damaging the unit. After they moved out, I entered the apartment with the property manager, and I will never forget what I saw. There were mountains of trash everywhere, and there was not a single inch of the floor that was visible. The sink was completely filled with waste and dirty dishes. Old food was scattered throughout the unit, and they had started using the second bathroom as a functional kitchen, washing dishes in the shower. The smell was overwhelming and nearly unbearable, and at one point I found an old used sanitary pad on the ground. The moment that truly broke my heart and later made me cry was when I saw the child's bedroom. It was just as filthy and chaotic as the rest of the apartment, and the child's bed was a small fitness trampoline with only a thin blanket on top and no pillow at all. Seeing that made it painfully clear how neglected that child had been, and it was absolutely heartbreaking. Story 11. I have a few experiences that may seem small compared to others, but they have stayed with me for a long time. Years ago, my mother worked for a septic company that also did excavation and some tree work. It was a family-owned business, and everyone had known each other for decades. An older man who my father had previously worked for, and who had since retired, was dropping off a trailer full of tree debris in the back pit of the property. A younger employee, who had only started working there about a year earlier, was waiting for the older man to dump his load and pull out so the next truck could go down. When it started taking a long time, the younger employee walked down into the pit to check. The truck door was open, the older man was not responding, and he was found lying on his back barely breathing, with the gate of the truck open and one massive tree stump lying on the ground next to him. The young employee ran back to the office gagging and yelling for someone to call emergency services. We did, and then rushed out back to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation while on the phone with dispatch. There was not much blood, but it was obvious the man had been crushed by the stump and that his internal injuries were severe. We still tried everything we could, but he did not make it past the road sign at the business before passing away in the back of the ambulance. A few years later, shortly after my wedding, emotions were already running high after several stressful weeks involving my sister's boyfriend at the time, who was abusive and manipulative. I had been arguing with him at my parents' house and had already been drinking, and when things escalated, I drank even more. After he left, my sister and my mother were angry at me for what I had said, and I told my husband to take me home. He gathered our daughter and me and said something to my youngest sister about staying out of it. My mother thought he was talking to her and was surprised because he rarely spoke back. As he was backing out of the driveway, my mother leaned against the outside of the driver's side window, something our family had done jokingly many times before. He did not see her, was looking over his shoulder, and could not hear her over the yelling. When he turned the wheel to straighten out, he accidentally crushed her between the vehicles. She collapsed immediately and quietly asked for help. I got out and assessed the situation, instantly sober, while my aunt helped load her into a car to get to the hospital. My mother could not move from the waist down. Scans later showed her pelvis and sacrum had more than 25 fractures, both large and small, and she was bleeding internally. She spent over a week in the hospital, was sent home in a wheelchair for 6 months, then used a walker for another 3 months, and somehow did not need surgery. The most disturbing part for me was not seeing the accident itself, but watching her bleed internally and fearing she would not survive. The last experience is my mother's own story from when she was a teenager. Her parents owned a restaurant on a main road, and one night an abusive couple who lived nearby left intoxicated. Later that night, a family member said she had seen a body on the side of the road. When they all drove down together, they found the woman severely injured, bleeding, and struggling to breathe. My mother stayed with her, speaking calmly and trying to comfort her until emergency responders arrived. The woman passed away shortly after. Evidence pointed to the boyfriend's truck, but he had access to repairs through his work, was never charged, and the woman died without justice. Story 12. I was working at a car wash a few years ago, and while I was washing a car like usual, I suddenly heard a crash happen right in front of the store. I turned around just in time to see a car spin off into the grass and an elderly woman get ejected from the driver's seat. She was thrown violently onto the asphalt, landing hard on her stomach, and I can still hear the sound of her head striking the road. I ran over to help because I was certified in cardiopulmonary resuscitation and first aid, but there was nothing within my ability that could have made a difference. She was unconscious with a steady stream of blood coming from her head, and her body was twisted in an unnatural way, her ankles bent inward and her arms positioned at impossible angles. I told the other people who rushed over not to touch her because moving her would only make things worse. She briefly regained consciousness, but all she could do was make low, guttural sounds that were impossible to understand. The man who hit her had spun out onto the opposite embankment and was able to get out of his vehicle and walk around before lying down in the grass. He was wearing a military uniform, and it later came out that he had been racing a friend, also in the military, down one of the busiest roads in town during rush hour near a large military base. The woman had been pulling out of a nearby Walgreens after buying groceries and was not wearing her seatbelt. I later posted about the incident online, hoping to find out how she was doing, and a family member reached out to tell me that she had suffered a fractured skull, a broken neck, 4 broken ribs, both arms and legs broken, and shattered ankles. She had been in a coma for 2 days when they contacted me, and then they told me she had passed away. The man who hit her did not have a single scratch on him, and I never found out what happened to him afterward, though I still think about how he should have been held responsible. Story 13. My former roommate and I were driving to pack up her apartment as we were preparing to move in together when we noticed that the freeway we normally took was completely backed up, so we decided to take the road that ran alongside it instead. She asked me to look ahead to see if I could tell what was causing the delay. As we continued driving, I saw a large truck with a car transport rack pulled over, along with multiple fire trucks, an ambulance, and several police cars. As we got closer, I noticed police officers and emergency medical personnel using small shovels and carefully dumping what they collected onto a gurney. When I looked at the gurney, the only thing I could clearly recognize was a blood-covered head with the face turned toward the road. His face is burned into my memory, frozen in what looked like a scream and completely covered in blood. That was when I realized they were shoveling pieces of his body onto the gurney. He had been riding a motorcycle, splitting lanes, when he was dragged underneath the truck and torn apart. I had nightmares about it for months afterward, and even now cannot hear a motorcycle without immediately seeing his face in my mind. Story 14. I was in Argentina volunteering, where I usually help teach English and coach field sports, but one of the other volunteers took me to an extremely poor orphanage. Like many places like that, the children were fascinated by our sunglasses and cameras. Most of them were very poor girls who seemed to take care of the younger children until they eventually left. Aside from the head woman, who was likely around 40 and disciplined the children violently, the oldest caretakers were no more than 15 years old. One child in particular was severely impaired. He had dry bumps all over his skin, which I was told were not contagious. He was physically small, closer in size to a 7-year-old, but I was told he was actually 13 or 14. Mentally, he behaved almost like a feral animal. It is difficult to even describe his level of cognitive ability. There was no shared language, and there seemed to be very little understanding beyond basic pleasure and anger. It felt like witnessing a child whose mind had been replaced with something animalistic. The entire situation felt hopelessly dark, and the most disturbing thought I had was that this child should not exist. Even though I consider myself a compassionate person, that compassion evaporated as I watched him have violent, nonverbal outbursts and lash out at other children. I am ashamed to admit that in that moment I thought that this situation should not be allowed to continue, both in the sense that no one should live in such extreme poverty, and also in the sense that this severely neglected, stunted child was not recognizable to me as human in the ways I understood. With time and perspective, I know that in a different environment, with proper care and support, he could have had a chance at improvement, even if I did not understand his condition. Still, those thoughts remain deeply disturbing to me, and that is why I will never forget that experience. Story 15. I was 16 years old, sitting in my bedroom in the evening, playing a game on my Nintendo 64. It was pretty quiet except for the sound of the television, when suddenly I heard screeching tires. At first it did not seem like a big deal, since there was a fraternity house at the end of the street with rowdy guys who liked to speed and do burnouts in the neighborhood. It was annoying and dangerous, but it happened often. This time, however, the sound came from the opposite end of the street and was immediately followed by a loud crash. My parents and I ran outside to see what had happened, and at the T intersection on the other side of the main road, there was a car sitting in someone's front yard, facing back toward the road. Further up the street, it was clear they had hit a small dip in the road while going far too fast and intoxicated, lost traction, spun out, and slammed the rear right side of the car into a tree before spinning around. I got down there first, and in the back seat were two guys lying completely still. One of them was missing half of his face after his head smashed into the window when it shattered against the tree, and the other had one arm bent upward at an unnatural angle through the missing back window, while one of his legs was twisted in a way it should not have been. The driver and front passenger were stumbling around outside the car, and the driver handed me his phone because he was too drunk to call emergency services, so I made the call. Both of the passengers in the back seat had been killed instantly. Story 16. This did not happen to me directly, but to a close friend a couple of years ago when we were still in high school. My friend was taken to and from school every day by a paid private bus service. One morning, as the bus approached the school area, it passed through a narrow, rundown side street near the main building. While scrolling on her phone, my friend happened to glance out the window and saw something deeply disturbing. On the side of the road, she noticed a young girl, around her own age at the time, pressed against a wall, while an adult man stood close to her in a clearly threatening way. The girl was crying out for help, visibly distressed. The man's back was turned toward the bus, and everything about the situation felt wrong and alarming. Terrified, my friend immediately told the other students what she had seen, but the bus kept moving. The driver did not stop. Passing cars continued on, and no one on the street intervened. When she arrived at school, she was shaking and in tears as she told us what had happened. Some people brushed it off or assumed there must have been a misunderstanding, but a few of us, including her and me, reported it to teachers. They said they would notify the appropriate outside authorities. After that, we never heard anything further. We do not know if action was taken or if it was ignored, but her bus route was changed, and the bus never went down that street again. Story 17. When I was 13 years old, my aunt took me on my first trip away from my rural hometown in the Northern California Redwood region to visit Los Angeles and San Diego. Late one night, while driving on a Los Angeles freeway, traffic suddenly slowed almost to a stop. It quickly became clear that something serious had happened ahead. Emergency responders were still trying to reach the scene. We passed damaged vehicles first, and then the remains of a motorcycle further down the road. My aunt told me and my 8-year-old cousin to close our eyes, but we did not. It was a motorcycle rider wearing full protective gear, and it was the first time I had ever seen a body so badly damaged. Most of the body was still there, but twisted and contorted in ways I had only seen in horror movies. I remember seeing the lower jaw and teeth visible through blood, and the helmet was partially intact but destroyed where it had impacted, exposing severe injuries to the head. There was not as much blood as you would expect, which somehow made it even more disturbing, and the scene was so fresh that you could see small muscle movements as traffic crawled past. I did not speak for the rest of the night. The three of us have never spoken about it to each other since. More than 23 years later, my nephew claims he does not remember who I am, which deeply saddened me because the rest of that trip was actually wonderful. But when I think back on that moment, I understand why. Story 18. This happened around 10 years ago in Santa Cruz, California. I lived a few blocks away from a convenience store on Laurel Street, and at the time I was often intoxicated and would walk there late at night to get food or drinks. One night, after turning a corner, I walked straight into a violent attack where a teenage boy was being stabbed. He tried to run past my roommate and me, but the group chasing him caught up and attacked him right in front of us. There was nothing I could do, even though I thought about it for a moment, because there were 5 or 6 attackers. I made eye contact with one of them who was holding a knife covered in blood, raised my hands, froze, and then ran. The boy died there in the bushes near the store. I cooperated with authorities afterward and learned it was some kind of gang initiation. That kid was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I was only a minute away from being in his position. Even now, I sometimes still hear him yelling for help and see the terror on his face. And I do not know why I typed this out again. Around the same time after I moved back to Southern California, I worked at a pizza and arcade place. One morning, two elderly women rushed in with a little girl who had no pants on and was bleeding. They said they found her walking along the side of the freeway and brought her to the first place they could find to call for help. The child was completely dazed, silent, and clearly not fully present. It was obvious something terrible had happened to her. I gave her free food and a drink, but she never spoke and just stared ahead. We closed the restaurant and called the police. And although many of us wanted to go looking for whoever did it, there was nothing we could do. The officers took her away, I filed a report, and I never heard anything else about it. That memory still hurts to think about. Story 19, I worked at a Waffle House near the most popular bar in my college town after I dropped out of college for a year. It was the same place that became famous years ago from a widely shared online post where a girl was dancing on a police officer while being arrested. Working the night shift there meant seeing chaos every single weekend. Most of what I witnessed involved extremely intoxicated young women accompanied by men who were completely sober. It was the same situation over and over again, a drunk girl having fun and being far too intoxicated to realize just how sober the man guiding her was. I knew what was happening, he knew what was happening, and everyone working there knew what was happening. But there was almost nothing we could legally do. I would try asking the girl if she was okay, or if she wanted me to call someone for her, and sometimes she would understand and call a friend to come get her, but other times she was too intoxicated to even process what I was saying. In those moments, the man would calmly guide her out the door before anyone could intervene. Those guys always had the same unsettling look in their eyes, hands in their pockets, scanning the room, acting drunk only when the girl spoke to them. It was obvious they had intentions, but there was no proof, and law enforcement could not act without evidence. There was no way to confirm whether a shady 20-something man in a hoodie on a hot summer night was a designated driver or not. My heart truly goes out to those girls because naivete can be dangerous. I also regularly saw 18-year-old women collapse in the street from alcohol poisoning and get taken away by paramedics almost every single night. There is also a darker side to the college rush culture that people rarely talk about, where young women feel pressured to maintain a certain image, leading many freshmen to drink excessively every weekend. They stumble around completely unaware of their surroundings in one of the most dangerous parts of town in terms of crime. I would drive home and see girls passed out in streets, parking lots, or outside stores, knowing anyone could rob them or hurt them, and there was very little I could realistically do besides alert the officer working security. After the bars closed, around 3 in the morning, a different crowd showed up. People struggling with addiction would wander in, usually harmless but unsettling. One man in particular came in every night around 3:30 in the morning asking for sweet tea. After explaining why he could not pay, he would sit alone and have full conversations with no one. The cooks told me he believed he was talking to his brother who had died years earlier. Watching someone argue with someone who was not there in an almost empty restaurant in the middle of the night was deeply unsettling. I still feel sorry for him, but I am grateful I no longer work there. Story 20. I was 13 years old when stunt pilot Joe Hartung died at the Lafayette Air Show in 1996. I was standing directly at the fence line with my hands resting on it, watching as his plane suddenly banked and slammed into the ground, killing him instantly. It happened directly in front of me, roughly 100 yards away, and it was the first time I had ever witnessed a person die. I do not believe it caused long-term trauma, but it affected me deeply for a long time afterward, especially because no one there expected to witness something like that at what was supposed to be a fun and family-friendly event. Looking back, what disturbed me almost as much as the crash itself was watching the crowd react. One moment everyone was enjoying the performance, and the next there was shock, confusion, and disbelief as the plane impacted and debris scattered across the runway. In the moment of impact and the seconds afterward, you could not even see him inside the aircraft. I never met him and only knew of him from the short description in the event program, so his death was not personal to me, but it was a powerful, shared experience for everyone there that day, especially those of us standing at the fence line, many of whom were children like me. It was a moment that permanently changed the atmosphere of what had been a joyful day and left a lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. Story 21. There are a few experiences that are difficult for me to rank, and I suppose I should say there is a warning for dark material ahead. Although anyone reading this likely expects that. The first is seeing my father's body after he took his own life, but that alone is not even the full memory. My now wife, who at the time was staying with us because of her own home situation and was slightly older than me, was desperately trying to resuscitate my father, even though he was clearly already gone, while emergency services were on the way and a dispatcher was on the phone. My mother was screaming in shock and grief in the background. I had been asleep and woke up to my mother screaming at the top of her lungs, then walked like a zombie to the back of the house to my father's room, trying to understand what was happening. This year marks 11 years since that night, and it is permanently burned into my mind. The second experience needs context. My mother physically, mentally, and socially abused me for as long as I can remember. I am autistic, and one day I was having a severe meltdown while she continued pushing and screaming at me, calling me useless, worthless, evil, and disgusting. This was after my father died, and she would tell me she wished I had died instead of him. I finally snapped and said I wished we were both dead. She then pulled out a loaded gun from her closet that I did not know she had and pointed it at me. Her face twisted into something genuinely terrifying, the most evil expression I have ever seen. In that moment, I knew I could never have a normal relationship with her. I had to beg her not to kill me, praise her as a wonderful mother, and degrade myself just to survive, before she turned the gun on herself and I had to talk her out of ending her life. When she finally put the gun down, I ran, and I honestly do not remember what happened afterward. Years later, when I confronted her about how that incident caused me severe post-traumatic stress disorder, she told me I was a bad child and that she was being a good mother by teaching me a lesson. Another disturbing memory was seeing the aftermath of a van that had its entire back half crushed by a large truck that fell from an overpass. The scene was horrific, and the next day I learned that two babies in the back seat had been killed, which made me physically sick. My wife once came across kittens that had been torn apart by dogs, with fur and small severed limbs scattered across blood-covered concrete. Even though I did not see it myself, the idea of it deeply affected me, especially because she had been trying to convince family to bring the kittens inside and rehome them since the mother was missing and stray dogs were nearby. She was young and did not know what else to do at the time. The last thing I will mention is that my uncle murdered his wife during their divorce and then took his own life. Afterward, I was given artwork he had made, along with a dagger he had used in ritual acts involving animals. The art was extremely disturbing, filled with themes of violence, hell, and death, and everything about it carried a heavy, vile feeling that is difficult to describe. Story 22. I spent a couple of years working for the Attorney General handling applications for long-term and dangerous offenders. Long-term offenders were people who would serve a prison sentence and then be placed on an extremely strict supervision order for up to 10 years, while dangerous offenders could be sentenced to prison for an indefinite amount of time. Eventually, we began working with the National Flagging Program, where we gathered evidence on offenders who had a high likelihood of becoming long-term or dangerous offenders. These individuals were often extremely violent psychopaths or severe sociopaths. I read countless police reports, witness statements, and victim impact statements describing aggravated sexual assaults that lasted 6 to 8 hours or longer, prolific offenders targeting children, domestic abusers who ruled their partners through terror, and people so full of rage that even a glance could provoke serious violence. I also reviewed psychological evaluations, prison records, school records, pre-sentence reports, probation histories, and more. One case involved an offender going to a victim's home and subjecting them to repeated assaults and beatings for roughly 10 hours before the victim managed to escape. Another offender began a night by assaulting one person and then went on to violently attack an elderly acquaintance. One offender openly bragged about abusing a newborn child in a hospital and claimed to have multiple unknown victims. And even psychological professionals could not determine whether he was telling the truth or fabricating everything. I saw autopsy and crime scene photographs of a man who had been beaten to death. I was also exposed to images that required confirmation by a dedicated officer because of their extreme nature, after which both physical and digital evidence had to be sealed and labeled. One video I reviewed showed a prison inmate repeatedly jumping on another inmate until they died in the yard. That offender's criminal history began before they were 12 years old, and by the time they were being assessed as a dangerous offender, they were still only in their early 20s. Story 23. When my father died, I spent 3 days with him in the hospital, and I have never seen so much blood in my life. Long story short, he had lived a very troubled life, with blood cancer being the final blow. Those 3 days meant everything to me, because it was the first time in years that we truly connected. The last real conversation I had with him ended when he became extremely fatigued, and we naturally stopped talking and instead held hands while looking into each other's eyes. We maintained eye contact for about 2 hours until I eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, one of my three sisters was sitting beside him, crying, and she quietly said to me that it was time. I jumped up and immediately noticed that his breathing was inconsistent and completely different from the night before. It was clear that his heart was only still beating because of the life support, so we began waiting for him to pass. After about an hour of watching what was essentially machines keeping a lifeless body functioning, I started to feel desperate, and for 10 minutes I genuinely had the intrusive thought of suffocating him with a pillow just to make it stop, before snapping out of it when my sister suggested turning off the life support. She shut the machine off, his breathing slowly faded, and he finally seemed to pass peacefully. Because he could not eat solid food, he had been drinking a lot of juice given to him by the nurses, and he also had internal bleeding in his stomach related to the cancer. After about 10 seconds of silence, as my sisters and I stood there taking it in, he suddenly began violently expelling blood from his mouth as if it were a broken fire hydrant. The amount of blood was unreal, spraying out with such force that his dentures flew out of his mouth. We all panicked. My sisters ran from the room, and I screamed for the nurses. When they arrived, something inside me switched, and I went from panic and shock into an overwhelming sense of calm. As his body finally stopped expelling the blood mixed with juice, I understood why there had been so much of it, and I felt peace knowing he most likely passed when we were asleep holding hands, and that this was just his body reacting as everything relaxed. The initial sight and sound of it was still horrifying, though. For at least a year afterward, multiple times a day at first, and then about once daily, I would briefly see and hear that moment whenever I blinked, even during normal activities like shopping, and I accepted it as my body processing trauma. About 7 years later, in April last year, I went downstairs in my apartment building to open the door for a friend when I noticed a neighbor lying at the bottom of a staircase. He was known locally for drinking heavily, so I initially thought he had passed out, but when I got closer, I saw an extreme amount of blood and realized he had fallen. I checked his vital signs and saw that his skull was literally cracked open, with thick, coagulating blood everywhere. He was breathing rapidly and shallowly, so I called emergency services and had two other neighbors bring cloths to place under his head and apply pressure. When I lifted his head as instructed, part of his skull shifted and I could actually see his brain. I followed the responders' instructions, then remembered my friend was waiting, so I ran to open the door while shouting that an ambulance was on the way. While waiting, the image of my father expelling blood came back vividly, and since my father had also been a troubled alcoholic, sitting there with this man in a pool of blood felt deeply surreal. When the paramedics arrived and took over, my body suddenly went into shock even though my mind was calm, forcing me to sit down and speak very slowly. About 3 months later, I opened the door for an older man who was looking for his son, who had been hospitalized after falling down the stairs. And when I realized who he was, the same flash images hit me, and I told him I was the one who found his son. This was the first time I learned the neighbor had survived, and his father was incredibly grateful, saying I had saved his life. A couple of months later, I saw the neighbor again for the first time, noticed the large scar on the back of his head, and felt my body briefly freeze. Over time, seeing him again looking happy and listening to music helped ease those reactions. He does not know who I am, and I am content with that, because each encounter is still a coin toss between seeing just a neighbor or reliving flashes of blood and trauma. I feel I have accepted both experiences, but they remain some of the most disturbing events I have ever lived through. Story 24. At my grandfather's funeral in 2016, during the procession from the service to the burial site, there was a serious accident. An SUV cut across the road in front of the funeral procession so they would not have to wait, and ended up in the lane going the opposite direction from us. After they stopped, they were rear-ended by a work pickup truck carrying ladders and equipment. I pulled my truck over and jumped out to help because I was an off-duty emergency medical technician at the time. The woman driving the SUV was very large, and the driver's seat had broken loose from its tracks and slammed backward onto her 1-year-old daughter in the back seat, who was not properly secured. The impact essentially crushed the child. All of her ribs were broken, her left eye was protruding from its socket, and she was only taking one gasping breath about every 15 seconds, each time coughing blood onto me. I felt her pulse growing weaker while I was on the phone with emergency services, relaying as much information as possible. I started cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but could only do compressions, not breaths, because I was certain one of her ribs had punctured a lung and she needed suction to clear her airway. When the ambulance arrived, I secured her spine by balancing her entire body on my forearm while supporting her head and neck and rushed her to the ambulance. I helped secure her to a spine board and told my supervisor, who was one of the responding medics, to call for air transport and leave immediately. After that, I went back and carried my grandfather's casket to his grave, with blood still all over me, including the new tie I had just bought and been excited to wear. I had served as an Army medic and seen many terrible things, but this was what finally broke me. I quit emergency medical services and even changed my career path entirely, leaving medicine for chemistry. I threw that tie away as well. The child's parents later found me on social media, thanked me for doing everything I could, and invited me to her funeral, but I could not bring myself to go. I carried a lot of anger toward them for having their beautiful 1-year-old daughter in a booster seat instead of a proper car seat, though I knew it was not my place to say anything. To this day, every time I pass her memorial on that stretch of highway, I think about her bright blue eyes and the life she should have had, full of interests, hobbies, and experiences. She should have been in a car seat. Story 25. I have seen quite a few things over the years. There was the 17-year-old boy who tried to take his own life, and later, while unconscious, his body forced him to try to rip the breathing tube out of his throat, even though that tube was the only thing keeping him alive. There was the woman who jumped from a multi-story parking garage and was found by children, and not long after I arrived, the air medical team did as well. In a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to save her, they began working directly on her severe head injuries, and the sight of brain fluid spilling across the pavement is something that stays with you. There was also the young baby, the first infant case I ever saw, being worked on by some truly incredible paramedics. But what sticks with you the most in situations like that is not the medical side, it is the family. Transporting the mother to the hospital while she screamed her baby's name in the back of the vehicle was absolutely harrowing. Another moment that will never leave me was having to tell a woman that her son had died. In movies, those scenes often seem exaggerated, where someone hears the news and collapses screaming, but that is exactly what happened. She fell to the ground and screamed in a way that sounded like her soul leaving her body. For those who do not see things like this regularly, it may be hard to imagine, but your body does adapt to some extent. You are not supposed to get used to it, but it is often the only way to keep functioning without breaking. Even though there is never a guarantee you will avoid post-traumatic stress, it does become more manageable over time, even if it never truly leaves you. Story 26. When I was around 8 years old, I was visiting my Lithuanian grandparents. I was a pretty sheltered kid, having grown up in a typical American middle-class family. So many things were completely new to me, like heating water with a metal bar, raising chickens, growing your own fruits and vegetables, and having a banya, an outdoor sauna. Most of it was actually fun. My grandparents lived in a very remote village, and considering that my family had survived the Soviet era, they were extremely hardened to harsh realities. Around the third week of our month-long stay, my cousin's outdoor cat gave birth. None of the adults seemed surprised. My cousin made a box for the cat and her kittens, and for several days there was a major family argument about what to do with them. In that village, stray cats and dogs wandered freely. People might feed them or give them shelter, but almost no one formally adopted them, likely out of fear they were sick. There were suddenly too many kittens, and intense arguments followed. At the time, I barely understood Russian or Lithuanian, so I only caught words like kitten, bath, and veterinary without thinking much of it. Later that day, all the women left to drive to the capital to shop, which was about an hour away, and my grandfather stayed behind. I was excited to go, but halfway there my aunt realized we were low on gas and turned back. When we returned, I went inside and opened the bathroom door out of curiosity. My grandfather was drowning the kittens in the bathtub. I can still hear their sounds to this day. I understand now that they believed they had no other option due to animal overpopulation, but at the time it was an overwhelming and horrifying culture shock that has never left me. Story 27, I was involved in a very serious accident and was found at fault. In short, I rear-ended another car at about 50 miles per hour because I did not notice their turn signal while they were slowing to make a left turn. At the last second, I realized they were stopped, and with no time to brake, I swerved. Instead of missing them, I struck the rear passenger side of their vehicle, which pushed it into the opposite lane, where it was hit head-on by a semi-truck that very fortunately was not pulling a trailer. I can still hear how violent the impact sounded. I was physically okay and immediately ran out of my car while calling emergency services. When I opened the other driver's door, his seat had reclined from the force of the crash. He was a man in his 50s, shaking and gurgling blood from his mouth. I held his hand, crying uncontrollably, convinced I had just killed someone who had simply been on his way home from work a week before Thanksgiving. It was the most disturbing thing I have ever witnessed. Emergency services arrived within 2 minutes because a fire station was only about a mile away. The man spent the next week in intensive care undergoing multiple surgeries and, incredibly, survived. The relief I felt was overwhelming because I do not think I could have lived with myself otherwise. I am not particularly religious, but that week I prayed constantly for him. As far as I know, he eventually made a full recovery. His medical bills totaled over $160,000, which my insurance covered, for which I am deeply grateful. Even so, the experience was extremely traumatic. More than 2 years later, I am eligible to get my license back, but I still have not, because I remain deeply anxious about driving and fully aware of how devastating an accident can be. Story 28. I was about 15 years old, riding with my dad from Frisco, Texas to Denton, Texas to visit some friends after playing in a basketball tournament. We were driving on a small 2-lane road when we came over a hill and immediately saw a car accident that had just happened at the bottom near a small bridge over a creek. I do not know exactly what occurred, but it looked like a small black sedan towing a jet ski had lost control, which made sense since there was a lake nearby. The trailer and jet ski were several yards away down in the creek, and the front of the car from the dashboard forward was completely destroyed. As we approached, we could see what looked like the driver's lower body facing us through the shattered passenger window. He was not moving, but at first it looked like he might have been slumped over and possibly trying to crawl out through the driver's side window. As traffic slowly moved into the opposite lane to pass what remained of the car, I looked back because I wanted to see if he had made it through the window or if anyone was helping him. Instead of seeing a person, I saw something that looked like a piece of meat sitting where a torso should have been. There was no upper half of his body at all. He had been sliced almost cleanly in half at the waist. His lower half, still wearing pants, was completely intact and sitting inside the car, while his upper half was gone. Something from the crash, either the trailer or the jet ski, must have torn through the car and taken his upper body with it. I thought I was fine for about 20 minutes afterward, until a large insect hit our windshield and my stomach finally gave up everything I had eaten. Story 29. Out of everything that could be considered disturbing in my 32 years of life, the hardest thing for me was watching my grandmother slowly disappear while her body was still alive. She went from being supportive, loving, and caring to sitting in a nursing home unable to recognize anyone or remember anything beyond fragments of her childhood. We knew she had dementia, but at first she was on medication that kept it from getting worse. Early on, you could barely tell anything was wrong aside from her misplacing things. Eventually, she stopped taking her medication, throwing it away and lying about it. She went from living alone and doing well in her late 60s to dying in a nursing home as a shell of the woman I loved, someone who had already been gone long before her body finally gave out. When she was first placed in the nursing home, my mother and I visited as often as we could. Watching her decline so quickly was unbearable, and over time we visited less and less. My mother would never admit it, but the emotional pain was too much for her. Eventually, she could not bring herself to go anymore. I still visited occasionally, but each time my grandmother would either barely acknowledge me or mistake me for someone from her distant past, although she always told me I was a handsome young man no matter who she thought I was. Even though my mother stopped visiting, I could see how much it still tore her apart and how guilty she felt. I eventually sat her down and told her she should not feel obligated to visit anymore, and as painful as it was to say, I told her that the woman in the nursing home was no longer her mother, and that my grandmother had already moved on. I expected anger, but instead she calmly told me I was right. During my final visit, my grandmother lay in bed staring blankly, completely unresponsive to me or the nurse. I kissed her on the forehead and left. She passed away that same day, immediately after I left the room, but before I even made it out of the nursing home. I did not learn this until days later when I spoke with a nurse. The entire process lasted around 3 years and was deeply disturbing, but I choose to see a small comfort in believing that the grandmother who helped raise me waited for that final visit before letting go. My mother handled the funeral with grace, and I believe she had already grieved long before my grandmother physically passed. Story 30. When I was in about first grade, my parents went out for the night and left me with a babysitter. Instead of staying at our apartment, we went to one of her friends' places a couple of blocks away in another large apartment building, where we hung out with her younger siblings. Eventually, she realized it was late and that we needed to head home. We went down a back stairwell and exited through a door into the alley, since it was quicker than walking all the way around to the front. As soon as we stepped into the alley, we both noticed a horrible smell. We could not see very well because the street light was at the far end of the alley, but we could make out piles of trash and debris. She took my hand and started guiding me forward. After only a few steps, the smell became overwhelming, and my babysitter tripped over something. She stumbled forward but caught herself, and when she jerked ahead, I stepped into something slippery and almost fell, but she managed to hold on to me. When we finally reached the end of the alley where the light was better, we saw what we could not see before. Next to the dumpsters was a body. Whether he had been cut open or something had torn him apart, his insides were exposed. That was the source of the smell, and that was what we had both tripped on without realizing it. Story 31. Mine may seem minor compared to many others, but it has stayed with me. When I was about 14, my parents and I went to buy potatoes for planting from a man who had several dogs. He was clearly struggling with addiction. His house looked like it was collapsing, and garbage covered the yard. The most disturbing part was the dogs. They appeared to be huskies or mixed breeds, and they were so thin you could count every rib. They were filthy and looked starved. The oldest one walked up to me and rested his muzzle against my leg, and all I could do was pet him and try not to cry. If that were not enough, nearly 3 years ago, my mother's estranged eldest daughter, who had been gone for 9 years, suddenly reappeared with 2 children. She needed help moving, and my mother and I went. The boys had no clean or safe toys, only items taken from a local dump. In the yard, there was a swing set missing a leg, replaced by a piece of sharp metal tied on. The younger child was 2 at the time, and the older was 7. The rest of the yard was filled with broken wood, concrete, and useless debris. Inside the house, there was an unbearable smell that made me nauseous. In the boys' bedroom, the floor was completely invisible, covered entirely by broken toys and filthy clothes, and they had to step on the mess to reach an old metal bunk bed with no blankets. The bathroom ceiling had a large leaking hole with flies everywhere, and a bucket catching the water. When I went outside to get air, the boys showed me their playroom, which was a sunroom attached to the house. Inside it was a broken window frame with shattered glass scattered across the sandy floor. One child was 2 years old, the other 7. The place they moved to afterward was even worse, consisting of 2 hollowed-out trailers on a tiny plot of land, cluttered with rusted tools, blades, boards with nails, and broken glass everywhere.